So the announcement of a snap election in France is probably one of the biggest curveball thrown in politics after the aftermath of the European Parliament election. Of course, we're also observing the rise of the right. What does all of that mean? Joining us right now is Mr. Scott Lucas, professor of the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Well, thank you for having me here.
So first of all, I would like to start examining the situation in France. As we know, this is a very dynamic situation. Analysts have been scratching their heads ever since Macron announced the snap elections. And people are saying that maybe he hopes that the right will not be able to consolidate before the election take place. What's the current situation and what's your take on it?
Well, I think the situation as we face the first round of the elections on June 28th is that no group has a majority in French politics, according to the polls, and I think the readings of public sentiments. Now, a lot of the headlines have focused on the so-called surge of the far right. They focused on Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party, which did get 31% of the vote in the European elections, which triggered President Macron's snap election declaration. It also includes smaller groups like Reconquest. But it should also be noted that there has been an increase in support for parties on the left of French politics. That ranges all the way from the Socialist Party across to the far right party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And it is significant that this week, those center-left to left-wing parties have declared their own bloc. So you have a right-wing bloc, you have a center-left bloc, and they're sort of squeezing, at this point, Mr. Macron's centrist party and the coalition. I should add one other thing. If you and I had talked about French elections almost at any point over the past 70 years, we would have been talking about the center-right, what would have been the Republicans' party. What has probably been the most important feature in French politics, even more than Mr. Macron's problems, has been the near collapse of the center-right. And that is why we've seen sort of this polarization in French politics, or at least the polarization of the far right, simply because the center-right, unlike in other countries, simply is not there right now for the French.
All right, a lot to unpack here, so thank you for giving us all that information. First of all, I would like to ask you whether, well, a lot of people have been projecting the European Parliament election and thinking that would correlate to the situation that would happen in the snap election. But as we know it, the European Parliament election and any national French election has a very different structure and turnout rate. So do you think it's correct to use the European election results as a projection to what will happen in the upcoming elections?
I think you can say from the European election results that certainly the hard right is in a better position, perhaps the best position it has been in decades of trying to take power in France. But I don't think you can use the European elections as a predictor of what's going to happen. First of all, because as you noted, the way that national elections are run is much different. They go over multiple rounds. You have a choice of multiple candidates. There is transferable voting in the French system where people could move from one candidate in the first round to another one in the second round. In other words, you're going to see, I think, a fairly fragmented result. But the second reason I mention this is simply because a British politician, Harold Wilson, once said a week is a long time in politics. Even this fast-paced French election, which is over the course of 3 weeks, might seem like an eternity. Let me raise a couple of things that have already happened only in the last few days. First of all, the hard right has split. The Reconquest Party, which is the smaller of the far right parties, is in open warfare, expelling one of its leaders. Secondly, the center right party in France has imploded. The leader of the center right party wanted to form a pact, an alliance with the far right National Rally. The rest of the leadership rejected that. He locked himself in headquarters and finally had to be removed and was thrown out of the party. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, the center left and the left have sort of formed this bloc, which I think will be significant. Now, that's only in the last 4 days. Imagine what could happen in the next 2 weeks. I do think it's going to be hard for Mr. Macron's centrist coalition to get the largest number of seats in the next National Assembly. But because no party will have an overall majority, in the National Assembly. We don't know right now what the coalition will look like, the governing coalition, and therefore we don't know what the new prime minister might be.
Right, like you mentioned, the situation in France seems to have accelerated so much that every day it seems to be a different news cycle with more events coming out when it comes to this particular topic. And I would like to go back to what you mentioned earlier about the collapse of the center-right, or just the polarizing nature of, if not just France, the entire European politics. Can you help us understand the reason to that and what is contributing to this phenomenon that we're seeing right now?
Here, I've got to make an important distinction. What is happening in France is not what is happening across Europe. There were a lot of people who looked at the European elections and wrongly reported it's a surge of the far right across the continent. That's not true. While the center right has collapsed in France, the center right gained strength in European elections. The European People's Party, which is the largest bloc in the European Parliament, and its center right parties gained seats. It gained as many seats as the hard right did. Why is that happening? Because in certain countries, the center parties, and here I'll refer to both center part and center left, they actually held out against the extremes. That happened in the country where I live, in Ireland. It has happened in your country, in Poland. It happened in Spain and in Portugal. So while the far right made gains in some countries, we could talk about Austria, we could talk about Belgium, as well as France. Notice, for example, that in Hungary, Viktor Orban's party suffered its biggest setback since he has been in power from 2012. So, in fact, the center is kicking back in Hungary. And if you go to Scandinavia, it's actually center left parties that did the best. So the European situation is more of a patchwork. It's more of a patchwork because from country to country, the issues might differ. And what that means when we get to Brussels is that probably you will still have the largest coalition. The power will still reside from center right across to center left rather than on the extremes.
All right, so thank you for helping us making that distinction. Like I mentioned, that we can actually observe with different countries having very different results with the kind of patchwork that you're talking about of very different various countries. So if you can help us understand what are maybe some of the topics, some of the through lines through these elections, and what are the stances of these various countries that are holding their electorates together?
Well, I think you obviously will refer to the way that the economy is perceived in various countries. And that depends on how each country is doing in terms of its industry, its trade. But I also think that is now being affected by the agricultural movement. We've seen the rise in a number of countries of farmers' movements, some of which who have aligned with the right wing parties, some of which who have formed their own parties. I think that in turn links up to the issue of climate change because many of these farmers' parties are saying that the climate change regulations of the EU, they're the ones who are suffering from having to implement them. So that becomes an issue. Immigration is, of course, an issue, especially because it gets magnified, distorted, even falsified in social media. And so how each country perceives immigration affects its politics. But I think we also have to talk about the question of foreign policy. And here, of course, China is an issue, the Middle East is an issue, but the foremost issue is still the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think here, the European Union has risen to be an essential force to stand against that invasion from the center right to the center left. So let's be clear, linking up to your earlier story, that even as we were talking about the Global Peace Summit, reinforcing support for Ukraine and calling out the Russian invasion, you've got Vladimir Putin issuing another ultimatum on Ukraine. And then across the water in the US, you have a man named Donald Trump, who, as you noted earlier, issued a stream of lies, and they were lies, to effectively say, I won't help Ukraine at all. So the European Union, beyond all these individual domestic issues, has this foreign policy presence. Whether that will be recognized in the elections across countries in the next few months, the next couple of years, that's going to be important not just for the future of Europe, but for Ukraine and Poland as well.
Right. So as you rightly mentioned, there's a lot of very common topics when it comes to the European election, namely the economy, the green issue, immigration, foreign policy. So what separates France from the rest of these other countries that we're seeing this dramatic sort of polarization that you mentioned?
I think there are a couple things in France. I think France has had, economic difficulties over the past few years. We saw it with, for example, the Yellow Vest protests that have taken place. I think in other countries you've had those economic issues as well, but you've had the center parties who've been able to project the fact that they could ride out the economic storm. Again, that's happened in Ireland, where, for example, the party on the left, Sinn Féin, was the one that suffered the most, even though it's in opposition. It happened in Spain and in Portugal, for example. In France, that hasn't happened. I don't think Emmanuel Macron has been able to establish a center party, not just Macron, but a party which has shown the ability to project stability in France. Because also other elements of the center have disappeared, we mentioned the center right earlier, it leaves France vulnerable for a hard right, the National Rally, which has projected itself as being a normal party, a process of normalization, or what the French call de-demonization. So the hard right, almost fascist rhetoric of the National Rally is gone with a more acceptable face. We're just like you. We're just French. We don't like immigrants. We hate them, but we're not like the really hardline fascist rhetoric against immigrants of the past. And that softer face to hardline policies has made France different from other countries where the far right continues, I think, to be on the margins both in its rhetoric and in its actions.
All right, so a lot of it has to do with policy issues, but a lot of it also has to do with messaging. Thank you so much for helping us unpack this situation that's going on in France as well as across Europe. Really appreciate it. And thanks again for being with us on TVP World.
Thanks to you and all your viewers.